All right, thanks a lot, Maurice. I really appreciate that. So my name is Ian Mahar. I guess in terms of the affiliations that are most relevant to this talk, I was the former president of the Boston Postdoctoral Association, as well as the former advocacy chair. I'm still a board member, but thankfully very capable people have taken over the previous roles, Ezra as president and Zeke as advocacy chair. So this is sort of a presentation of some data we put together when I was filling those roles for the BPDA, specifically a survey from a couple years ago, right before COVID. I gave a presentation of these same data at the National Postdoc Association meetings a couple years ago. This time I tried to make it a little bit more tailored to the BPDA audience. That talk, because it was a national meeting, we kind of kept things, there was a little bit more of sort of a national focus on postdoctoral advocacy. I tried to trim it down a little bit to focus on the most important results to kind of give us more time for discussion. This is also a more informal event than that one, so I'm happy to fill as much time as people want with discussion because these are all topics that I think affect a lot of us here. So I'm grateful for the opportunity, and thanks again to the BPDA for asking me to go through it. So in general, I'm going to sort of briefly summarize what the BPDA is and why that's relevant to these data. I'll give sort of our goals for advocacy overall at the time and now. I'll go over sort of the design, and I'll try to squeeze as many results as I can into sort of a 35-ish minute presentation. Go over some interpretations and future directions for these data. But as I said, I want to leave as much time as possible for discussion. So please feel free to ask any questions either throughout or especially at the end of the talk as well. So for anyone that's not aware, the Boston Postdoctoral Association, or BPDA, is a 501c6 nonprofit organization. It's entirely volunteer run. The number of postdocs in the Boston region that it represents changes over the years, but it's generally over 8,000 Boston region postdocs. And we collaborate with Boston area postdoctoral associations, postdoctoral offices, and a large number of institutes around the Boston area. So in order to sort of understand what the BPDA does functionally, I find it's usually helpful to kind of break it down into its constituent committees in terms of the individual functions. So we have a committee for career development. We have a committee for communications that Maurice very capably heads up. And we have a committee for social activities for postdocs and advocacy, which is obviously most relevant for our discussion today. So the advocacy committee is sort of geared around, it was interested in sort of guiding our future advocacy efforts. And to do that, we sort of needed to discover what were the most relevant and important issues for postdocs in order to respond to those issues and prioritize them. So in order to do that, we launched what was at the time sort of the broadest and largest survey we'd ever sort of undertaken. So the goal of the survey was to identify issues that were affecting postdoctoral well-being and then use that to direct future advocacy efforts. The intent was to be as broad as possible. So we asked a very large number of questions in order to cover domains like the financial lives of postdocs, mentorship, career, and considerations for well-being. This helped us to sort of determine priority issues, not just in our population, but possibly a relevance to other postdoctoral populations. And we also wanted to identify populations with particular needs. So we specifically asked questions regarding international postdocs, postdoctoral parents, and other potentially marginalized or vulnerable populations in the postdoc community here in Boston. The general methods, we had an online survey that we disseminated across Boston area institutions. More specifically, we did a recruitment largely through PDAs and PDOs. The survey was online and via SurveyMonkey. It was open through May to July 2019. So it's a relatively narrow time frame, and it's also captures a time point right before the COVID-19 pandemic. The questions included sort of finding out about the demographics, financial issues, job-related issues, mentorship considerations, career, and also sort of the general stress and well-being levels for Boston postdocs. So we actually ended up covering everything in 85 questions. It was relatively broad and comprehensive, with the intent being that we wanted to sort of avoid any blind spots in our future advocacy efforts. This was reviewed by the IRB for Boston University Medical Center. So one thing that it's sort of an additional level of context that we can take looking back on it now is that there are some advantages to having a pre-COVID survey. I mean, obviously, we want data to be as fresh as possible often. So you know, we want to also obtain more recent data, and I'll talk about efforts for that in the discussion. But you know, there are some things that are actually advantageous to this data being in that really narrow time frame. So it sort of shows which peri or post-COVID issues weren't temporary consequences of COVID. So, for example, assessments that were done during or after COVID, it's difficult to tease out how much of those potential issues were a consequence of COVID as opposed to being unrelated to it. This also provides additional data for subsequent longitudinal analyses that are in preparation. And at the time, and for some questions, even today, this is the most recent survey to cover these broad domains. These data guide Boston postdoctoral advocacy priorities, including future surveys, and then provides info not just for us sort of on the advocacy side, but gives us sort of information to provide to stakeholders in a broader outreach audience. So we obtained results from 628 Boston area postdocs. I'm going to be showing some of the data for that. This is something that we haven't published or completely released a data set for. It's largely been my fault and not getting on it enough, but it is something we're planning for the near future. But that means everything I'm presenting here is still pretty preliminary from that perspective. And we included participants from 25 different institutional affiliations across the Boston region. In terms of demographics, these were primarily respondents from STEM faculties, which is fairly representative of the postdoc population in Boston in general. 92% had a PhD, 10% had an MD. They were roughly even for a ratio of male to female participants. The average for postdocs in terms of their duration of time in the role was less than 2 years in their current postdoc position, although around 30% had a previous postdoc. Now, one thing I really want to focus on is the fact that only 1/3 were US citizens, which is necessarily unsurprising, given that a large proportion of postdocs are international. But it goes to show just like the scope of why the international postdoctoral issues have such a high priority. And in fact, it informs a lot of what we saw in the data, particularly for international postdocs. Now, here we have responses. The lines in purple are folks that are Americans or permanent residents. But for the remainders, we have it sort of ranked from not at all concerns to extremely concerned on a few issues. And basically, of those respondents that were on temporary visas, 88% said that their visa status affected their future career opportunities, and 82% of these said that it was either moderately to extremely a consideration. So for those on temporary visas, they also said that it was 80% said this moderately to extremely directed their decision to stay in the United States, and also was a source for distress and concern for them to either a moderately or extreme degree. So for those folks that were international, which is a very large proportion of the population, it was a pretty large concern even before COVID. In terms of their ability to have access to funding, for the 59% of the respondents to this question that were international, 89% of foreign postdocs felt that their foreign status in particular limited their ability to apply for or obtain funding. So we have sort of objective measures for this in terms of what types of funding the international postdocs are not eligible for, but this is sort of a more subjective metric of how they feel they're inhibited from having access to funding. I want to focus to a bit more concentration on the financial part of Boston Postdocs at the time. These numbers are from 2019. At the end, we can talk about what some of the reference numbers would be in 2023, but income and housing are something that we identified as a pretty major concern for Boston postdocs in particular. So what we found was that the average salary in terms of the mean for postdocs was $51,802 with a median of $50,070. To put that in perspective, the NIH entry stipend, so this was with 0 years of prior postdoc experience, that level was set at $50,004. And we found that 45% of the population actually made less than this entry level. And that level, that's not to say anything about levels of experience past year zero. This is just using the year zero entry stipend. In fact, more than 50%, 56% made $51,000 or less. So it's very tightly clustered around that NIH entry stipend. And 90% of the postdocs made less than 60,000, 5% made less than 80 grand. To put that sort of in perspective for benchmarks for the average in Boston and in the US, the average salary for a Bostonian at the time was $77,000. It's considerably more now. And that was more than 98% of postdocs at the time. And in fact, if we look nationally, the average US worker with at least a bachelor's was making $71,864. And that was 39% more than postdocs on average. And when we get into the discussion, I can talk about how that disparity has not narrowed in the years since. In fact, it's grown even larger. For the costs for postdocs relative to income, so the housing on average, housing costs were $1,463 per month, or $17,556 per year, or 34% of the average salary. And here, this is compared against the mean, which is a higher value than the median. So on average, it's the 34% of their average salary compared to the mean. And if we use existing criteria for proportion of income, this would mean that the average postdoc would be considered under housing stress, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and 10 to 12% of the postdocs that we heard from would be determined as severely cost burdened by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And these numbers that we're looking at in terms of where they're actually housed, 3% used university housing, less than 1% owned their homes on their own, 7% owned with a partner. The vast majority were renters, so 81% rented, and 62% overall shared their homes with roommates. To sort of put that in context for what that means is sort of like the day-to-day and weekly activities of postdocs. They were working on average about 56 hours per week. If we use that to construct sort of an hourly wage, that meant that 40% of these postdocs made less than $5 above the Massachusetts minimum wage. 7% of postdocs were actually making less than minimum wage during the year that they were responding as postdocs. In terms of their PTO, and what they actually took, this is not what they were allotted, but postdocs took on average 11 days off per year, although roughly 1 in 7 took 0 days off per year. 96% indicated that they worked on weekends at least occasionally. More than half worked at least most weekends. Unsurprisingly, we find that this leads to attitudes of dissatisfaction with income. Not only that, but when we ask, do you agree that your salary is sufficient to cover your expenses? Over 59% disagreed, and only 28% agreed that their salary actually covered their expenses. In addition to that, we found that salary was negatively affecting the quality of life for 93% of respondents. So only 7% said it was not affecting the quality of life. 70% actually indicated that it was moderately to extremely contributing to a sense of concern or stress. And it was negatively affecting quality of life for 85% of respondents, 59% moderately to extremely. To try to put this as a sort of numbers as a whole, we also asked about other sort of fundamental or basic costs that postdocs are paying. For example, what they were paying for utilities, phone and internet, transportation, and student loan payments on average. These are the average values, and summed up, they come to $23,202, which is 45% of the average income for postdocs. Keep in mind, this does not include groceries. This does not include the cost of airfare for international postdocs to fly home, and the majority of postdocs are international. What's especially important here is that this does not include taxes. So if we add in childcare, which a certain percentage of postdocs did have to pay for, which I'll get into in a slide, for those that had to pay childcare, they were paying on average $22,561. So for a postdoc that was a parent and making the basic payments for amenities, they were paying about $46,000 of a $52,000 salary just on the basics. But what's really important is that this does not include taxes, so they actually wouldn't have been able to afford taxes at this level. And I think this highlights in particular one of our priorities, which is postdoc parents out of the respondents. So 18% of the respondents were of these postdocs were parents. The vast majority did not receive a child care subsidy. So 84% didn't receive any subsidy. And when they did, it averaged about $449. This was less than a third of their average child care costs. So in terms of the financial situation of the position, to try to summarize it, I think it can be instructive to sort of think of it as presented in a hypothetical job description, in which one would read, this is a job in which you're working 56 hours per week, you're frequently working weekends, you're taking less than 2 weeks off a year, you're getting paid often less than $5 above minimum wage, you are typically under housing stress due to housing payments averaging almost $1,500 a month, probably split with roommates. Your basic expenses without groceries will average about 45% of salary pre-taxes. And for those folks that were postdoc parents that additionally have childcare costs of over 17 grand per year, with only 12% receiving childcare subsidies from their institutes. And this would be, a position that has a doctoral degree as an entry level requirement. So I find that kind of helps put these numbers in perspective. But there are a lot of other factors that contribute to postdoc conditions apart from income. Some of these are the particulars of their academic jobs, as well as mentorship. So in response to the question, what's your current level of satisfaction with your postdoctoral supervision or mentorship? I thought this was actually fairly positive. So postdocs were relatively satisfied with their mentorship overall. So 2/3 were satisfied or very satisfied, with only about 17% dissatisfied. Qualitatively, I actually was pretty impressed by the frequency of meetings with mentors. 75% met at least bi-weekly, which I think is pretty great. 90% at least monthly. So that was an encouraging sign to me. Only 42% received an annual assessment, although to me that's not as much of a concern when the majority are having regular meetings. So I do take that as a positive for their postdoctoral experience. In terms of frozen here, one sec. There we go. When there were mentorship issues, the most common were unreasonable performance expectations, supervisory neglect, verbal abuse, or breaches of academic ethics. The least common were physical abuse, sexual misconduct, or breaches of scientific ethics. These would be things like data fabrication. In terms of one thing that I found really interesting for the actual output of postdocs, we found something that I kind of think of as being analogous to an imposter syndrome effects at the postdoctoral level. So 39% of respondents thought they were publishing below the level of their peers, and only 9% thought they were publishing above the level of their peers, suggesting that other success is actually being overrepresented in the perceptions of postdocs. It's technically possible that all the most successful postdocs were just too busy to take surveys, but I like to think of it as maybe people have an unduly let's say negative view of themselves. It's something we could potentially address. speaking of well-being beyond their feelings and their output, I was really curious about, what kind of what postdocs' thoughts about their overall well-being, especially relative to these issues, might be. So when we asked the current level of stress for postdocs in the Boston area, the level of stress out of 10 that they gave was about a 7. For context, this is higher than the 4.9 average from the American Psychological Association's 2019 Stress in America survey, so roughly the same time period. And this group also, the APA survey also said that the perceived healthy stress level of those participants was a 3.9, so even further above that. Life satisfaction was below a 6 at 5.7. This is less than the US average of 6.9 and the OECD average of 6.5. On a slightly more positive note, a bit more than half of postdocs were satisfied with their postdoctoral experience overall, including those who were satisfied and very satisfied. And about the same proportion felt hopeful about their current postdoctoral position in terms of the future success, and how helpful they felt about their future career in general. So it was relatively consistent across all 3 questions of a bit more than 50%. On the other hand, they also described negative impacts of their postdoc on their mental health. So 40% negative versus 20%, 26% positive in terms of the net effect of your postdoctoral experience on their overall mental health. When we asked sort of what were the most important factors for postdoctoral success or well-being, the most common were mentorship, salary, job availability, benefits, Boston housing, and interaction with other postdocs. All of these were more than 50%. There's one thing that's really important to point out about this chart, and that is if you look at the visa and citizenship and immigration issues, this amount is actually alarmingly high, given that presumably few to none of the non-immigrant postdocs would have selected this option. So that means that this is driven by the proportion that are actually internationals, and so it does sort of reflect probably a relatively large concern, even when looking at the whole population. We asked sort of, in contrast, what would have the most positive impact in improving your well-being as a Boston postdoc as an open form question. Over half of the responses mentioned compensation or housing costs. 12% mentioned mentorship. I find this really important because mentorship is obviously an incredibly important aspect of the postdoctoral experience. I mean, it's really central to it. And it was still more than 4 times more common to mention compensation or housing costs in the same question. So this sort of makes it raises the difficult question of what is the overall situation for Boston area postdocs, at least from the perspective of these data that we obtained in 2019. I think it's difficult to concisely summarize the broad findings of 85 questions into a few sentences. I think that there are some moderately positive findings in terms of satisfaction with mentorship and their postdoctoral experience, as well as their future hopefulness for their career. However, it's also clear that Boston postdocs are more stressed than satisfied in their lives. There's some indication of negative influences of their postdoctoral experience on their mental health. And most importantly, there are clear financial focal points for salary and cost of living. And I think this is particularly acute for immigrant and postdoc parents that are facing additional stressors. Now, this is also something that we have to consider temporally. Is this something that might have been worse, during or after COVID-19, which obviously couldn't have affected these results, but would they be different if we looked at data from more recent cohorts? It's difficult to say. I'm looking forward to seeing what the results are of more recent surveys, but I haven't seen anything in particular that's made me think that that the situation has improved dramatically in terms of the relative well-being of postdocs in the Boston area relative to other Bostonians. One thing that came up a lot in terms of the discussion for the NPA meeting, because it was a national conference, is are these results that we can extrapolate to other cities, for postdocs in other regions of the United States? I went into a lot more detail at that meeting, but in short, I will say I think it probably is, just because a lot of the concerns we have here that are Boston specific are probably, they seem to be related to high cost of living. And there's a lot of really good analyses from previous years that shows that the concentration of postdocs in the United States is really very highly correlated with the cost of living. So most postdocs are in expensive coastal cities that have a high cost of living, that's similar to Boston's. In terms of what this might mean for our advocacy in general and sort of like how it might influence policy, I think that it's pretty clear that salary relative to cost of living is pretty far off the mark. It's also very important to note that in our data, the salaries that were reported were clustered extremely closely around the NIH minimum. And again, that's the NIH minimum suggested for 0 years of experience. So it's even more disparate for folks with more. And what also kind of, as a metric to sort of see how far we are from what postdocs need, it increased to $60,000, which would have been a substantial challenge advocacy-wise in 2019, would be a raise for 84% of the postdocs in the survey. But even if they received that, they'd still be $17,000 below the salary of the average Bostonian of any education level, and that gap has only widened in the year since the survey. So it seems pretty clear that large increases in a minimum salary guidelines, especially those provided at our federal level, are required. And also because we found a large proportion of postdocs that were making less than the NIH minimum, it seems clear that enforcement of minimum salary requirements is incredibly important as well. Housing was identified as a very acute source of stress for Boston postdocs. It seems like institutional housing subsidies or access to low cost housing could potentially go far to address this very specific issue that's also incredibly common. It was noted by a very large proportion of our respondents. A lot of postdocs expressed satisfaction with their mentorship, which I thought was great. However, I think that it's very important to point out that we also noticed gender inequality in mentorship. One thing I didn't go into too much detail here, but I can talk about if anyone's curious in the discussion, was just like with previous surveys, we found that the proportion of postdocs that had a mentor of the same gender was disproportionate, with men being much more likely to have a mentor of the same gender as themselves. And a recent survey from PNAS indicating that elite male-led institution labs and that hire postdocs are less likely to hire female postdocs into their labs. So it might be exacerbating that disparity as well. There's particular issues that we noted for postdoc parents. It's possible that childcare subsidies and facilities could address this issue. One thing that doesn't necessarily have to cost money, which is always an easier sell to PDAs and PDOs, is opportunities for socializing and networking with other postdoc parents, because that's something that that was also noted by these respondents. It's clear that international postdocs feel some visa vulnerability. I think that part of that was particularly acute during the previous presidential administration, but it seems that this is something that postdocs are likely to feel perennially, and it's something that is a source of support to alleviating that stress. Some interventions that could be made that are comparatively inexpensive, as I said, are probably easier sells. Postdocs also mentioned in some of the other questions that being able to keep their institutional emails would have been greatly beneficial to them. It's also probably in our best interest to encourage postdocs to take more time off, because they're taking off only about 11 days per year. We did find some indication of hostile work environments, although it's difficult to establish the prevalence. So I think that addressing hostile work environments is still something we should go further with collectively. And I think that requiring postdoc mentoring as part of funding awards is important, because there aren't always requirements for PIs to provide training as part of those, for example, with the recipient of an R01 that pays a postdoc salary. Now, again, as I mentioned, with how this relates to the potential specific value of these data as being pre-COVID, I think it sort of establishes a baseline for how things were in a way that sort of prevents anyone from preempting any of our concerns by saying, well, the data that you looked at from 2023 were as a result of us recovering from COVID. So I think that having that established in a point right before COVID was especially valuable. And I know that there are some folks, including Ezra and Zeke, who are doing a great job of planning for future surveys. So it'd be great to compare immediately pre and post COVID to really look not just at these two disparate eras, but also to sort of establish a general longitudinal perspective on postdoctoral issues. And the hope is, until then we get those data, these will be sort of an interim guide for our advocacy issues. So before we, the next couple steps for this data set, it would be great to do some analyses by demographic and sort of look at combinations of factors that contribute most to postdoctoral well-being or stress. There are other data sets, for example, surveys that were done by BCH that had large numbers of respondents with similar questions. It'd be interesting to try to combine those. And as I mentioned, repeating across cohorts. So there are some efforts to do some follow-up surveys in the near future to try to get to see how much of this is replicated and how much that is consistent across years. So I'd just like to thank some people that contributed to us getting this data. Megan Pierce was the co-chair of advocacy with me. The advocacy committee at the time helped come up with the questions. Sarah Hokinson at BU has been really helpful for postdoctoral advocacy in general, including this survey. Gary McDowell, who I thought I saw maybe in the participants, was really helpful in a lot of different ways. I think he's probably one of the most knowledgeable people in postdoctoral issues. So he also had a talk in this series that I really think everyone should check out. And as well, all the BPDA board members and volunteers that we have that are always pitching in for this stuff. And lastly, I was supported by THR and FRSQ during the time I was working on this, but not directly for these activities. And Boston University was great about being able to review it for the IRB. And thanks to BPDA for asking me to talk, and thanks for your attention. And I'm happy to discuss anything you're curious about.
Thank you so much, Ian. And I've seen you present these data before, like at the NPA meeting, and I mean it's just as hard, like the second time. I think probably everyone in this room can relate to at least one of the aspects that were surveyed here. And so yeah, just thank you for going through it.
No problem. Yeah, I know it can be a bit of a bummer. Usually when I give like scientific presentations, are not necessarily as depressing to folks. But yeah, I mean, I think it's important to get an accurate sort of picture in order for us to sort of guide our efforts.
Yeah, well, there were some positive elements in there too. And I do know there's been a few more recent surveys, like by the Harvard Medical Postdoc Association, that have actually led to some changes in salary recommendations, at least at the institute level. Do you happen to know how successful those have been in terms of actually leading to change in salary?
Yeah, so I'm not, I don't know enough about those data to really comment on them, or at least to feel comfortable that I won't misrepresent them. I think that since this survey has been done, some of the more important advocacy steps that we've seen, I would say what I was most heartened by was probably Columbia's unionization pushing all the way up from to a minimum salary of 60K. Which, at the time I was working on this, that would have been a huge jump for a lot of Boston Boston institutes. I think that's a big step forward. And we have some recent salary data that was presented, I think, in the first talk of this series that I think goes in a lot more depth about who's paying what and where we see differences. But I haven't seen that particular Harvard one, but I think the best thing for us is going to be what do, let's say, Zeke and Ezra come up with in their next follow-up to this specifically.
All right, so I'll open up the room for discussion. Just feel free to chime in. Also, if you want to type your question in the chat, I can read those out loud too.
Great. Yeah, the HMS guide, I'm just reading a question here that says the HMS guidelines are higher than the NIH guidelines. What happens in that case? Well, I mean, that's ideally the case at an institute that goes above the NIH guidelines. I mean, the NIH guidelines are expected to be a minimum, but are unfortunately sort of treated as a maximum by a lot of institutes, especially since there are institutes in the Boston region that will adhere to the year zero NIH guideline, but not any subsequent year. So for any institutes that go above it, I applaud that. At the same time, the NIH guidelines, they are set nationally, and the cost of living is not equal nationwide. And in fact, most postdocs are living in the most expensive cities in the US. So I think that there's pretty clear indications that this would be raised, especially if you compare it to, let's say, the average standards in those cities, regardless of education level, and the national average for even just a bachelor's degree relative to what the level of education these postdocs. So I think that the NIH guidelines should be higher, and I'm encouraged when everyone goes above it. But it seems that it would be easier to get institutes to go above to at least pay that amount by getting the NIH guidelines themselves to be adjusted relative to increasing cost of living. Is it just up to the PI to determine your salary at that point? Right. So what PIs often say is that, we're limited by the funding we receive, and the funding that a large proportion of postdocs in our other data, it was the majority are paid through training grants like an RO1. If the minimum amount that was provided, those training grants was up, that would probably mean that the PIs were paying more at that point. It's a pretty common argument point that the PIs feel like they can't afford to pay their postdocs more while being competitive in terms of getting subsequent grants and getting publications out. Whether it's up to the PI to determine your salary, yeah, the PI can go above the amount, although a lot of PIs aren't aware of that, as long as although it should be at least the level of the NIH minimum, if not considerably higher.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think also Boston specifically, we're placed so close to the biotech industry, or like all of the industries are right there. So it seems like profs would have even more of a it would be more in their face that, like, by not offering a high salary, they could lose their potential applicants to industry very easily. But it's like academia doesn't catch up to that sort of competition somehow.
Right. I think a lot of that is governed by historical precedent, where basically, PIs think, well, when I was a postdoc, it was normal for postdocs to not get paid very much. So why would things be substantially different for this generation? What's interesting in Boston as a particular test case is because it has such a strong private industry biotech sector, as you mentioned. And so it's very clear the not only the gap between industry and academia, but the fact that it's widening continuously. And the fact that postdocs are getting substantially higher salaries in industry, it's kind of difficult to rectify otherwise when you think, well, if postdocs are getting paid a lot more outside of academia, is it more plausible that they are being undervalued in academia, or that all of these companies that are extremely obsessed with maximizing profit are just unilaterally overpaying every single postdoc or former postdoc that comes there, or even folks that don't do a postdoc but have a PhD? I mean, I think it seems very unlikely that the biotech sector has this mass delusion of overpaying people with a PhD. It seems more likely that the more plausible explanation is that these people are not getting paid sufficiently on the academic side. And I think a lot of it is just because, like, well, that's the way it's always been. But I think that in cities like Boston, unfortunately, it creates a more acute pain point where people are suffering more with the increased cost of living. But I think it also drives a wedge into the divide, where it sort of becomes an issue that we have to face because it's just not perpetually tenable. So I think that, sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just going to point out, I've also felt like Boston postdocs kind of last a long time, like in terms of years compared to like other places or even countries. Did you get any data on that in this survey about how long people end up staying?
No, that's actually something that I think is really cool. Is that'd be a great thing to look at in the next survey. I will say that we found that 30% of the folks that we talked to were in their second postdoc at the time we caught them. And the average tenure of the folks that we talked to was less than 2 years, but that's only in their current position. So they could have been in their third or fourth postdoc at that point. So I think that one thing I'd like to do is we do have data on when they started their very first postdoc. It's just not in these analyses. So I'm curious if there is a correlation between the duration of postdoc and their attitudes. For example, how hopeful they feel about their career, how frustrated or stressed out they feel. I think that it is definitely a difference between the early postdocs and the later postdocs in particular. I'd like to know that. I would actually want, because what we've seen a trend with in over decades has been an increase in the length of postdocs. I mean, given the financial constraints, what I'd really be interested in knowing is, in the last few years, has that contracted at all, given that it seems less financially tenable, especially for folks that are looking to start a family, given the stresses for postdoc parents. One thing that I didn't have time to go through in the main presentation that I thought was worthwhile is when we talk about the, just as an aside, the differences for, let's see, for mentorship. Basically, I don't think I have them here. Yeah, one thing that I think is really important is going over the gender disparities for seniority, for both the PIs that are supervising postdocs. I think that's something that we should look more into in the next survey as well. Finally, let's see. One element that I wanted to show was the current values for income. So the most important metric for comparison was the 2019 numbers. What we've seen is that the NIH entry stipend has gone from $50,004 to $54,840, whereas the relative increases in Boston's salary has gone up by $7,000, and the average U.S. worker salary is much larger. So we're actually seeing that that divide increase. Are there any other questions about the data that we have? I think we might be going. We're at the 45-minute mark at this point. Cool. Well, one thing I wanted to point out is, these are issues that we sort of engage with perennially at the Boston Postdoc Association. If there's any questions, you can always email me at ianmahar@gmail.com. More importantly, you can get in touch with the BPDA in general. There's usually someone that responds pretty quickly at Boston Postdoctoral Association at gmail.com. Another thing that's very important is, we have a website that maintains a database of benefits comparisons, which includes salary information for institutes across the Boston region. This is helpful for advocacy in terms of allowing postdocs to compare where their institute is relative to others and seeing where there might be points for improvement that they can bring up with their own administrations. And that's something you can always discuss with us if you have any questions. So thanks again for everyone that showed up, and hopefully the data have been interesting for it.